Hey folks, I'm saying this at the beginning so you don't forget, like the video, subscribe if you want to see more. Pokemon manga sounds like a popular thing to do, yet it's somehow a niche topic, so you really gotta make that love known. Anyway, on with the show. So I hit a creative roadblock, and then something happened. The end of Ash Ketchum's adventures in Pokemon seemed to be drawing near, and as you know, I like taking a look at the old House of Mouse Empire while it was still in its infancy, and as the public is waxing on nostalgically about the end of a 2.5-decade journey of the iconic everyman hero Ash and his best pal Pikachu, let's likewise turn back the clock on, not to our own collective millennial childhood specifically, but back to a time where the future of Pokemon was unclear. Before routine soft reboots every 3 years, endless continuity, more Pokemon than countries on the face of the earth, and very meticulous style guides that dictate exactly where the boundaries of the Pokemon world, and by extension property, could go, and once again into the weird world of manga adaptations. Of the Generation 1 manga adaptations of Pokemon, only 3 of them would end up hitting stateside for a very long time. The Red, Blue, and Green, and later Yellow arc of the Pokemon Special manga, Pokemon Magical Journey, that is absolutely getting its own video at some point if I can ever find scans of it, and Dengeki Pikachu, or Electric Tales of Pikachu. None of these seem to have a specific style guide, and didn't seem to adhere to any particular style in general, outside of a general fleshed out world relative to a Game Boy RPG, that seems to have a ton of room of interpretation of the material. And this was at a point when Nintendo was still more or less comfortable lending out properties without hovering over its adaptation too much. Pokemon Adventure is going to be something that I compare this to a lot, so maybe this might even be a companion video to that or vice versa. But the subject of today's video is Electric Tales of Pikachu. And this is a great example of things that are adapted from a Nintendo property, but not necessarily in themselves feeling the need to be too adherent to it. Whereas Pokemon Adventure was more than happy to turn a relatively bare basic video game into a fairly dense, lore-heavy shonen epic that grew into standing proud of its own legacy and proud of the legacy of its source material while never being afraid to do its own thing, not only out of creative passion, but also out of necessity, because you can't just tell the exact same story over and over again for this type of long-running shonen series. Electric Tales of Pikachu was, in many ways, not that. Toshihiro Ono would have the script for the anime when writing chapters for this manga, but not the actual anime episodes. The two seem to be made in tandem, or at least initially from as far as I can tell. I can't quite find any solid release dates, but an interview at Dogasi's Backpack indicates that episodes of the adaptation were based around an episode that would have been airing around the time of its release. Following the adventures of Ash, Pikachu, Misty, and Brock traveling around the countryside and doing anime stuff, but with a very particular Toshihiro Ono take on Pokemon as a property. This is largely another series of vignettes similar to the first half of the Red, Blue, and Green arc of Pokemon Adventure, but it's a little bit more clear that Ash is having adventures off-screen, and commonly even references them. From other mundane episodes that wouldn't have forwarded the plot too much, up to how he even got other mainstays of his team during that arc like Squirtle and Bulbasaur, to even the events of Pokemon 2000 being largely an afterthought or footnote mentioned in the finale. Another huge departure here is while guys like Pikachu and Clefairy are cute, most of the Pokemon here are radically off-model. Ono's interpretation of Pokemon are gnarled and gruesome. Creatures with jagged features and sharp teeth and claws. Pokemon with huge gaping maws like Gyarados and Onix look like they are dangerous sea creatures, and don't quite have the same soft, ambiguous, rubbery features that would normally be the default appearance of Pokemon. These have cold, slimy features, or scaly flesh, webbed or even bizarre fingertips that are optimized for sea life and swimming. Dangerous Pokemon like Kangaskhan and Nidoking and Charizard make it very clear they aren't just necessarily cool, but also dangerous apex predators. Artistically, Ono isn't shy about depicting Pokemon with slightly more reptilian features, up to being outright draconic. On the other hand, cute Pokemon usually have physicality much like a house animal. Ono even states he had trouble giving certain Pokemon physicality, and that's why so many of his Pokemon's traits are very exaggerated. Pikachu was based on Ono's gerbil, Eevee was obviously based on house cats, Meowth has a certain stuffed animal-like quality to it, and that translates here into being a bean-filled stuffed animal that's bottom-heavy so it can keep standing upright, and the examples of this go on. As someone who really dislikes the up-until-recently tendency of modern Pokemon art to depict Pokemon in a very unspecific plasticky-like figure, I'm a huge fan of trying a little bit harder to give Pokemon some amount of physicality instead of the vaguely undefined plastic-like features that Mario would have, where it's very clearly been a little over-designed or even sanded down, and has a very clean sheen to it. Again, very reminiscent of toys on a good day, and bad 3D model renders on a bad day. For example, does this look like a creature with fur or a creature made of yellow felt? A creature made of flesh and blood or a creature made by a marketing committee? Exactly. So while I'm not usually a big fan of Ono's designs, I really do appreciate all the creative liberties that he takes with Pokemon. As far as Ono's pedigree is concerned, he is the illustrator for the Banner of the Stars, Sora no Kanata no, and allegedly Pokemon Tales, a series of young children's book that I can't really get a good citation on, and can't find any scans of, but I know for a fact that they exist. And the most notable of his pedigree, and quite possibly the reason why this series is so notorious, and my theory for why, despite being the most popular of the first 3 Pokemon manga to hit stateside, and would never quite get an omnibus or legacy release, is his history with H manga. I'm not going to say the name because YouTube will not like that, but you can Google it, and I'll let you find that. I wish YouTube wasn't such a hard PG platform, because this would be a great time to make a long tangent about Ono's more adult endeavors, and seems to have taken some experience working on Dengeki Pikachu into that, and how they share a lot of creative DNA, especially for the more voluptuous nature of the women he draws. But that's a story for, well, I was going to say another day, but probably never. But I guess that's fine, because in the same way that you can probably make a pretty solid retrospective about Jackie Chan without really going much into his history as an adult actor, you can probably talk about Pokemon while doing the same, right? Anyway, the end result of this is Electric Tales of Pikachu had so many minor edits and changes that needed to be made for an American market, like reducing bust size, adding tights, and straight up erasure of a couple of pages. They even asked Ono himself to make some of these changes instead of just making minor changes in-house. My speculation is that Electric Tales of Pikachu was unlike any other Pokemon manga on the market. On the marketing side, Viz Media knew that this is how you justify having so many edits. It's the year 1999 and Pokemon is running hot and fast, and you have to get as much material in there as possible. The other manga were mostly concerned with the video games, but remember to make sure that Pikachu was there. However, in America, the House of Pikachu may have that big yellow mug plastered all over the place on promotional material, but the primary method of consuming Pokemon is the anime. And that's the type of thing that involves having some sort of characters, not necessarily mascots. The broad idea is to cast a Pokemon as Ash Ketchum, the plucky but inexperienced trainer with more heart than brains, whose early struggles were marked by the conflicts between the haves and the have-nots. Misty, the hot-headed, no-nonsense, bug-hating tsundere, and Ash's sometimes will-they-won't-they romantic interest, and Brock, the former leader of the Pewter City Gym and the more reserved eldest of the trio, who's also a lecherous love-struck loser. No other manga quite had that for early Pokemon, and these are all traits that are unique to specifically the Pokemon anime. No other Pokemon at the time had an overlap with the anime's continuity either. While it may seem minor on a broad scope, and other media may occasionally ape elements of the anime, the Pokemon anime has all types of tropes and characters and is relatively unique in Pokemon as a property. Specifically that it's largely the primary way a lot of people would end up consuming Pokemon content. My theory is that while Pokemon in all its facets may seem ubiquitous for longtime consistent fans, the barrier to entry for even playing the games of old is not just playing the game, but also owning a Game Boy, being interested in video games at all, and also having an endless stream of batteries, and also money for that matter. And given that the primary audience of Pokemon are young children, and they are more or less tied to their parents' finances, that may not always necessarily be a possibility, depending on the economic class. However, on the other hand, a 4-year-old doesn't need to understand stab, party composition, or an intuitive type matchup, but just Pikachu is my friend and Ash is my friend. And sometimes just appreciating the anime. You don't need to have video game literacy or the money for that at all, because most houses have televisions in them. You just need a TV and an outlet. And to my understanding, or at least in America anyway, Pokemon in its early years primarily aired on public television, making it about as easy to access as media can be. The perfect storm of ubiquitousness among its anime and video game peers. Ash and Pikachu were the guys on the side of buses and TV ads, not Red, in a debatable starter with a random assortment of 5 out of the other 141 remaining Pokemon. And at a time where comic books were mostly limited to notoriously uncasual-friendly comic book stores, in a time where manga as a genre was struggling behind a niche genre already in a niche form of media that has the unique challenge of being in black and white, and has the great marketing filter that determines most releases wouldn't be in the form of tankobon, which would likely be a better release format that we know about today, but manga was split into floppies like their American counterparts. And, like their American counterparts, were made a little unintuitive on where to start. For those vaguely familiar with this comic, you may not know what the name Electric Tales of Pikachu came from, because you may also know this series as Pikachu Boogaloo, Surf's Up Pikachu, or Pikachu Shocks Back, because the 4 tankobon volumes were split up into 4 short series that were then split up into 4 volumes, each containing 1 chapter. Oddly enough, these 4 volumes were collected, sort of, into 2 trade volumes with seemingly a scattered assortment of chapters, and most of the single volumes were generally sold in sets of 4, and sometimes even along with VHS tapes of the Pokemon anime. So even despite being a relatively widely available comic book, or at least as far as comic books go, it has probably never been shown in an unflipped paperback format. I can only imagine, given the popularity of the series, that either by Nintendo's hand, they probably just didn't want Ono's association with Pokemon. It could also be a rights issue where it's unclear who exactly owns this series right now, because companies are prone to buying each other out, and due to poor record keeping, could lead to situations where a company buys out another company and has no idea the other company had a manga wing, so now nobody has any idea who owns a series, or hey, maybe you could track them down, and when you ask them, hey, I'd like to license your manga, they say, oh, this is a beer company. This is a real thing. And the explanation for not having a modern day release that I think holds the most water is around Generation 3, when the English manga releases would be in Barnes & Nobles instead of relegated to comic book stores. This was at a time when Nintendo was deciding to handle everything involving their properties in-house, including the Pokemon Company. As you likely already know, with things like Nintendo having all their translators be proper Nintendo employees, or having the Pokemon anime be dubbed by the Pokemon Company as opposed to 4Kids. This would also mark about the endpoint of Pokemon Adventures still being ran. Nintendo would begin to ease up on this particular policy and allow Viz Media to re-release their manga on their behalf. And a lot of manga would actually do quite well. I never thought I'd see a world where we're just getting Mario Mania or the Kirby manga on the regular basis. And luckily for series like Pokemon Special, it's just still going, and Heart Gold and Soul Silver happen to be coming out right as the last thing we've seen from Pokemon happened to be the thing leading up into the original Gold and Silver arc. However, not every series would be that lucky, hence history being scattered with the remains of Pokemon manga that, because Pokemon fans can't read, are mostly untranslated. I can already feel myself talking more around the manga than the manga itself, because the way Pokemon handled itself as a property tends to be a very good lens of how to view the societal forces around it, and where Pokemon Adventures has a very specific, huge world of unending conflicts and material of relatively tame consequence, or at least general vibe, Electric Pikachu has... Okay, you know what? Before we all die of old age, let's just get into the plot of Electric Tales of Pikachu.
Who's that Pokemon? It's Hitmonchan! Hitmonchan!
Ash is a normal 10-year-old boy who dreams of being a Pokemon master. But for this version of Ash, it's more of a distinct dream, like reading that book you've been putting off, or actually starting to go to the gym and being 20 pounds lighter. Ash finds a Pikachu causing electrical trouble in the floorboards under his house, and like a good citizen does, he does ethical pest control, just putting the thing in the woodlands. Pokemon references Pikachu being a rat quite a bit, but it seems that only in Dengeki Pikachu and Pokemon Special do they reference it being a bit of a pest. In Special, it's because it steals food and sneaks around and just has a bad attitude. But here it's because it gnaws through electrical wiring like actual rats do. Again, these early adaptations of Pokemon are fun in that they don't quite have that Nintendo oversight where they're free to acknowledge that, hey, maybe your chief rodent might actually be a rodent similar to Disney. While the parent company would probably rather die than remind you that its primary mascot is a rodent. Anyway, Ash bumps into Gary, who is starting his Pokemon journey as well, with the latest model of the Pokedex, with plans on taking off from school as a trainer, as trainers are allowed a break from school to become Pokemon trainers, albeit only for a limited amount of time, and competing in the Super Ball competition. Again, this series also seems to be made before everything in Pokemon was sort of locked down and had Nintendo approval, so it looks like Viz's localization squad did not catch that Super Ball is actually just the untranslated version of Ultra Ball for the English version. Anyway, Gary takes off on his journey and badmouths Ash before he leaves. Ash sets off to go on his own journey, but his rage quickly turns into ambition, as Ash has a huge crush on Gary's sister, who's more than happy to support both boys. Gary's sister has actually been in most Kanto-based games, as supporting both the protagonist and rival, presumably because she knows that Red, or in this case Ash, before they hit puberty, were actually very good friends. In fact, the Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow manual actually mentions that these two boys used to actually be quite close friends. So it's interesting to see this little fact touched down upon. Also, since we are still in relatively early Pokemon lore, it is fun to see what tidbits are noted by what writers and what tidbits are passed up by others. The manga takes a moment to do a little bit of world building, specifically for stuff in the Pokemon world, which is a far more technologically advanced world than we're used to seeing with Pokemon, are not certified by the Silph Company, but by the Pokemon League itself. Their logos are printed on the Pokeballs, the Pokedex, Ash's hat, and can be seen in tons of other places as well. Pokemon training isn't something that anyone can do. You have to, of course, be at least 10, and take a day-long seminar in Pokemon battling, rules, catching regulations, safety, training, pass a short written exam to obtain a Pokemon license, and be legally certified as a Pokemon trainer and eligible to take on gyms and purchase Pokeballs. Of the certified trainers, that isn't exactly a huge amount, they are broken down into ranks, attached to the number of badges that you have. Trainers that are of the Earth rank can enter the Pokemon League, presumably like the Pro Circuit of Pokemon. After we see Ash hasn't accidentally captured Pikachu, but he's doing the whole rubber gloves and string situation more as a normal leash because Pikachu is friendly, but it's not tame. And early on, it's more that Pikachu is leading Ash around, being dragged around more like a huge dog. Ash is just sort of goofing around with Pikachu, but gets pulled over by the cops for being kind of incompetent. But he's trying his best. They exposit a little bit about how rare it is to see a beginner trainer with a Pikachu and license. Gary shows up again to taunt Ash, and technically Ash doesn't have any Pokemon. This Pikachu is just his friend, not a registered proper Pokemon. And for a third time, we see Ash trying to get Pikachu into its Pokeball, but giving up and just settling for being pals. Another interesting quirk here is that Pikachu's early anime quirk of shocking Ash is contextualized here as not being spiteful or outright disobedient, but just some animals tend to be a little bit more playful and don't know better and will bite or have excitement pee, or just respond to too much stimulation. For Pikachu's case, instead of biting or peeing, it's electricity. Misty shows up and just mentions that she thinks Pikachu is very cute and exposits a little bit more about only about 20% of applicants actually become trainers, and of them, only about 5% actually go for the league, which again, I presume is like a professional sport. Pikachu ends up provoking a group of Spearow, causing Ash to need to steal Misty's Spike to outrun the Spearow, along with a boss Spearow that Pikachu provides a last-ditch Thunderbolt to actually shock it, but this time, instead of just running away, Ash catches the Spearow, wrecking Misty's Spike in the process. From here, Misty will on again, off again be tailing Ash because that bike actually costs a small fortune, but he really doesn't feel good about pawning that off to his poor mother, which is pretty understandable. Dengeki Pikachu is pretty consistent with taking the basic premise of a few Pokemon episodes and just sort of doing their own thing with it, remixing where you have to, but also just fusing a bunch of different plot points together when you need to as well. This is probably because the manga is bi-monthly, so we mostly just see a bunch of snapshots of Ash's journey. For example, by the next chapter, he's already caught Pidgeotto and Caterpie. Ash beats Brock relatively single-handed, but Misty points out that Brock's is pretty lax and darn near gives away badges to trainers. But Brock is convinced that Ash is going to be a great Pokemon master one day. I didn't really mention it before, but the elite of the elite here are called Pokemon Masters, so it isn't necessarily someone with every single Pokemon. It's also only mentioned for one gag, but Pikachu is named Jean-Luc Pikachu after Picard, and Caterpie is named Felix the Cat. I don't know what this joke was supposed to be in Japanese, but I read it one time and I'm still thinking about it 20 years later. Also, the Felix joke just sort of stops because it turns into Metapod. So, there we go. Ash sets out to challenge the Cerulean gym leader, thinking it couldn't be any tougher than Brock, but turns out it's Misty, who challenges Ash, much like the anime, to retrieve his hat from her, with Misty's Pokemon barring the way. Ash is in a tough spot because Pikachu doesn't really want to fight a friend, or, for that matter, there's a horrifying Gyarados. Fearow is sleeping, and Pidgeotto has apparently flown the coop. I wonder if Ono just didn't care much for Pidgeotto, and just is more of a Fearow guy. This is because Fearow actually becomes a staple of Ash's team in the manga, which is interesting because I think this is the only time I've ever seen anyone have much of an affinity for Fearow. So, it's up to Metapod, who is, just this. For what it's worth, I do appreciate this manga's sense of humor. In the manga, Ash's journey is contextualized a little bit more as very specifically a coming-of-age tale, where Ash, by the end of his story, is much closer to being a Pokemon master than he was at the beginning, and this is his first real step. Misty drives home that not a single one of Ash's Pokemon listened to him. Ash may have a lot of fun goofing off with his Pokemon, but if he wants to be a real master, he's going to have to try a little harder than this. Ash's Metapod would turn into Butterfree and put Misty's Gyarados to sleep. With the coast clear, Pikachu tries to get Ash's hat, but is distracted by Misty luring it away with food. Ash uses the same trick of tossing a dumpling at Misty's head, leading Fearow to spring into action to grab the dumpling along with his hat, because dumplings are, I guess, Fearow's favorite food. Anyway, Ash claims a Cascade badge, and Misty gets on Ash's case for winning more or less out of luck, but her sisters point out that luck is also a big part of battling, and weirdly accusing Misty into being into younger men, a joke that I'm sure would be really funny to me if I was 10 again, but I'm like an old man, so there we go. Interestingly enough, this chapter was also chapter 3 or 4 in the English release. This is because this was the first chapter that required a ton of changes. I think Viz was relying on this series being bought more so in single volume floppies, similar to Ranma 1/2, because this had some continuity issues with Chapter 3, where Ash finds out that Pokemon are ranked by rarity, and what would boost its rarity a lot is catching rare Pokemon, like on Mount Moon, which apparently comes after this section of the story. Anyway, he sets out to look for a Clefairy and stays camped out for weeks, but is ambushed by a wild Onix that his Pokemon are woefully underprepared for. And, in Pokemon Red and Blue, if you didn't have a Squirtle or Bulbasaur, which Ash is not here, there are literally no Pokemon that have a good matchup against Brock's Onix, and they draw a lot of attention to that here. The best Ash has to work with is a Butterfree that is okay, but it's not going to be easy. Ash is then rescued by Professor Oak, who here is a silver fox-like character who's been hanging out with Clefairy, and his assistant is Bill, who seem to have some particular unspoken relationship throughout a lot of early Pokemon media that maybe we'll talk about in greater detail one day, because it's all very interesting. Anyway, the Professor and Bill teach Ash a lot about understanding Pokemon in more of a semi-spiritual fashion, and the next day, the Professor sends Ash on its way, a little bit older and wiser, with an upgrade to his Pokedex. I'm skimming a lot of the information here because not that much happens, if I'm being totally honest with you. However, this is also why I'm only doing the play-by-play for only a few select chapters. In the same way that the Pokemon anime only has a handful of select interesting episodes, sometimes interesting things don't always happen in the manga. Sometimes stuff happens where Ash and the gang just sort of chill out for a while, and then the resolution just sort of happens, and the company Ash had for the day just sort of take off. Anyway, we catch up with Ash a few months later in Saffron City, ready to take on the gym leader Sabrina, who's more of a shrine maiden than the two-personality psychic that we bump into usually. He also finds Brock, who is pretty happy to finally see Ash again at long last. Ash, similarly to the anime, is humiliated by Sabrina, but he's invited to stick around the gym to train for a while. And here, I like that Ash and Brock end up sticking together for a big part of the story, because they're both girl-crazed dude bros. There's a certain male solidarity here that has a slightly more interesting subjects than two normal hentai guys, because the implication here is that we're more or less following the Pokemon anime's canon, where Ash doesn't really have a father or big brother figure as far as we can tell. And unlike the anime, that role isn't really filled by Professor Oak. While Ash looking up to Brock as sort of a big brother figure may not be as wholesome as most Pokemon media, I do appreciate this interpretation, because naturally an older boy who would be way more experienced as a trainer, Brock would be the kind of person that Ash would probably gravitate to in these sort of big brother-like roles. Anyway, Sabrina goes off to look for a giant haunter called the Black Fog. The Pokemon use this Dream Eater to eat souls, stopping people from passing on into the afterlife. Yeah, I know, pretty brutal. Sabrina is defeated by the Black Fog, so Ash and Brock and a group of trainers from the gym spring into action to chase down the Black Fog to its home in Lavender Tower, a spiritual spire that is almost old as humanity itself, and has been long abandoned and catch the Black Fog in a giant Pokeball. This thing is actually quite menacing, and that it's very interesting that, again, most Pokemon media is content to let this kind of thing just be a marketable friend instead of a spirit of unimaginable malevolentness. Again, skipping ahead a little bit, Haunter is an ancient Pokemon that is worshipped by the people who built Lavender Tower. Slowly, technology has gotten better, and people stopped offering Haunter tribute, hence why it's now wreaking havoc around the countryside. It was just so mad being demoted from deity to just Pokemon that its pride just couldn't take it, and sought to punish those who did not offer it worship. Ash gets close to catching it, but the Haunter would rather literally die than be subjugated by the creatures that used to worship it, using Explosion to commit suicide. I'm not joking. So I guess Explosion is actually lethal, including if you're a ghost Pokemon. And if a ghost Pokemon dies, I guess it's dead for real. There's a lot to discuss here. And it's interesting that usually the relationship between Pokemon and technology tends to have a theme of finding a balance between nature and Pokemon. And the ultimate conceit is, it's not nature you should be worried about, it's putting yourself in a position for ultimately sabotaging yourself, and nature slowly healing itself by just releasing the land to pave over whatever humanity has been getting up to and hoisting it by its own petards. For example, awakening or making a Pokemon so strong that you yourself can't tame it and saying, "Oh, whoops, how could I be so foolish as to play God?" Nature's generally going to be fine in the world of Pokemon. It's humans' relationship to it that's the issue, which I guess that's not too far off from real life. So we rarely see Pokemon getting worshipped as literal gods that demand tribute, and let alone worship under threat of summoning its ire. And we don't really see the role of technology pulling back the curtain on these deities to just be another creature that just sort of exist in this world. So Pokemon seems to have its own version of the God of the Gap situation. A lot of these things are things that are relatively easy conclusions to draw from Pokemon as a property. In fact, in Pokemon Arceus, you can also see some of these conclusions sort of being hinted at, but it's something that's never really overtly stated within the lore of Pokemon. Anyway, I don't really have too much to say after the Black Fog chapter, mostly because it was probably the high point of the manga for me. So in brief, Ash has a bunch of other adventures on and off screen, loosely based on his adventures with the anime. Ash deduces to travel specifically with Brock because they are blood brothers now, bonded over the love of big breasts and training Pokemon. Misty also tags along because she's kind of into Ash and serves as a straight woman to Ash and Brock's antics. Jesse, James, and Meowth are also sometimes here, but are notably less gay. I think they're also way less interesting this way too, but at least Ono seems to have some love for robots, or at least drawing them, because Team Rocket does get a few of those. That's actually one strong point this manga does have, is that it has a huge focus on technology in the Pokemon world. Everything feels very so slightly more mechanical, akin to a more, at the time, modern day contemporary anime of the late 90s than the usual ambiguous 70s or 80s, but we have computers vibe that Pokemon tends to push for. To my understanding, Ono wasn't specifically interested in Ash or Misty or Jesse and James being a couple, but his editors maybe push for that, and maybe the straightening of Jesse and James just make them way less interesting. Without the queer coding that Team Rocket tends to be iconic for, they just fall a little bit flat, just Bill and Ted as bank robbers. In fact, I'm pretty sure Ash even calls them that at some point during this series. Another interesting note is that the rest of Ash's team seems to work almost like work friends, but Pikachu is his only real friend. And this even shows. In the chapter Goodbye Pikachu, Ash gets ready to let Pikachu go, and bitterly jokes about playing with his other Pokemon while the Pokemon kinda get burned. Oh, that's a little funny, but I guess it's interesting. Like, oh no, without Pikachu here... Oh god, I might actually have to talk to Firo. Oh god, I hate that guy. He always has weird opinions on Elon Musk. Oh, and that whole Eevee episode, here is contextualized by a very weird, but very harmless cult. Anyway, I think the most notable thing about this chapter, to me anyway, is that TMs are not disc, but boxes of knowledge that you just kind of crack over the Pokemon's head. And, you know, I like this. I like this a lot. Nintendo, what are we doing? I can definitely see the knowledge going into the Pokemon head, but you just can't eat a disc. We should have kept it at the knowledge egg. Anyway, off screen, Ash gets the rest of the 8 badges. None of this is shown on screen. He just kind of has them now, and it's time to enter the Pokemon League. And like the anime, he meets a boy named Richie, who is basically just Ash, but maybe a little bit more organized, and they're paired up against each other. This is sort of the end of Ash's on-screen development. The match looked really close, but Ash really wants to win, and thinking instead of picking a weaker Pokemon, he picks Charizard, that he knows he has a hard time training. Charizard would end up losing, but it seriously ends up hurting Richie's Charizard. Richie's Pokeball's returning mechanism isn't working, so it really gets injured and mauled by Ash's Charizard. Ash calls his Pokemon back and immediately surrenders the match. While he may have sort of won the battle, it's very clear that Ash is not the superior trainer here. Usually in the anime, this is sort of treated as a joke that Ash's Charizard doesn't listen, but here it shows that he's learned a very real lesson, and that he needs to play more responsibly as a Pokemon trainer, and it was foolish of him to send out a strong Pokemon that hasn't been trained very well, especially when there's so much on the line. But luckily for Ash, Richie isn't too upset with him, because this is just a mistake, and that's what Pokemon centers are for. Richie also ends up beating Gary later on, so Ash can see that maybe it was for the best that he lost this one, because had he just called this one a win, he may have had a situation where it was Charizard who won, not him. But Ash pulls himself together and goes for one last, very rushed voyage to the Orange Islands, where Ash conquers the Orange Crew in about 4 chapters. 2 of those chapters are actually a 2-part finale of him just battling Drake, the leader of the Orange Crew, and the only really interesting part about this is Pikachu climbing into Dragonite's mouth to shock it from the inside. That's pretty cool. And then we sort of flash forward to the ending, with Ash and Gary teaming up for the second to last chapter, and ending up as a pair of traveling buddies in the last chapter titled Type Wild, serving as an epilogue. Ono probably knew this series had a very finite run and wouldn't run infinitely, or at least close to like its anime counterpart, so he opted to let Ash and Gary have some level of closure, mostly to let Ash grow as a person, while also letting the rivalry between the two end up flaming out to just be a certain rivalry and friendship with a mutual respect for each other that eventually the anime seemed to sort of come back around to, except for that Gary has mostly retired as a trainer, and the idea that two friends can just sort of get on each other's nerves, but also ultimately just be good friends working together is more or less fine, and that feels like a mature way to end this type of thing. It's great because as wonderful as a rival as Gary is from being of a place of wealth and privilege and just overall being a smug asshole, Gary isn't a bad person, but the kind of guy you just want to beat. In the Pokemon anime, Ash never really has too much real closure with Gary, or at least at this section of the series, so it's nice to see that this arc wraps it up in a way that's nice, even if it's not an iconic 6v6 showdown that I think Nintendo owes us reparations for, because we were obviously denied it, and I will continue writing them every single day saying that you really goofed up for not giving us a showdown with Ash's 6v6 versus Gary Oak. What is wrong with you? Anyway, where was I? Right. The final chapter, Type Wild, is an epilogue and probably one of my favorite endings to any Pokemon property. It's just a humble, reformed Team Rocket delivering a letter to Ash's mother and his friends in Pallet Town, just recounting that he's having a lot of fun on his journey and recounting a lot of the fun things that he's seen in the last several chapters. He offhand mentions the events of Pokemon 2000 as well. This is a very low-key and very humble ending, but I feel it's very powerful. It's just as simple as Ash saying he's doing well, he's having a lot of fun, and he misses home, but has made a lot of new friends. Maybe this is subjective, but I think this shows how much Ash has grown from the start of his journey. He's now perfectly capable of taking care of himself, and as a parent, I would imagine that there's no greater thing than hearing that your child is off having their own adventures and able to take care of themselves, and couldn't be happier, but a bittersweet ending knowing that the bird has ultimately left the nest. Ash's journey will end sooner or later, not necessarily because the Pokemon anime continuity actually does end it, apparently, but because you can only take off a year for school. And I guess I'm a sucker for endings that are more or less, and life kept on moving, but the audience isn't going to be a part of it. And while it firmly says no to sequel, it also opens the door for more. The title Type Wild seems to be a fan favorite ending in the Pokemon anime and even has been reused a couple of times, and I can definitely see why. It begins with talking about Pallet Town and kicks off in a crescendo that calls for adventure and ends with cool nostalgic music mimicking the opening of the song. And I think that vibe applies here with that same slow ending of knowing that more adventures are going to happen, but for today, this is the end. And speaking of endings, let's do that. So this is a manga that is very special, I think. Everything about it screams adaptation of another thing that's not necessarily just a game. It is an adaptation of an anime that is an adaptation of a game that has the role of being one part children's entertainment for the uninitiated and one part spokesperson for the game. And I'll take a moment here to grandstand. I actually don't care much for one adaptations. I think a medium shouldn't be afraid to change up stuff based on what it's adapting itself into. And this series fundamentally carries that approach. Media adaptations, I don't think, should ever really be one for one, with as close of a retelling as you can really get. I love that this series feels comfortable taking a stab at a time where Pokemon's sort of recent episodes would still be airing and remixing them into something totally unrecognizable, so if you are someone watching the anime, you actually have a reason to pick up the manga. And I appreciate that while Ono doesn't have a ton of editorial direction, he wasn't afraid to just stick to its strains of talking about technology and being a big pervert guy. Now, I don't think all those things paid off. They certainly didn't. But I do love this strange little adaptation of Pokemon, including the Pokemon designs, and recasting members of its cast to in some ways be bigger or some ways be smaller, and recontextualizing Ash's journey to be a finite one that will eventually come to an end, not because of the grim reality of you wake up at age 40 with 60 gym badges and only 2 trophies to show for it, but because that's just how the world works. You go on a trip as a teen as a rite of passage, and eventually you go back to school, and if you're really into it, you become a pro later on. And while normally I can't stand airhead anime perverts, I really do appreciate casting Ash and Brock's friendship a little differently as just two dumb, irresponsible brothers. And it kind of really drives home that Ash doesn't really have too many positive male figures in his life. So it's interesting to see that this property that now seems to be more or less intent on trying its best to stay timeless with maybe hints of technology or cultural changes behind the scenes that maybe at most just add mechanical justification for various changed game mechanics. Much like Pokemon Adventure, it is very interesting to see Pokemon being adapted in radically different ways from its normal Disney-esque attitudes. For Pokemon Adventure, it's seeing it adapted as a more Dragon Ball or Hunter x Hunter-like shonen drama with action and long-reaching implications and stakes, and seeing iconography from games recontextualized into a shonen formula. For Dengeki Pikachu, it's seeing Pokemon and Ash & Company from a more PG-13 rated lens from a hentai artist, specifically a hentai artist who's trying to hide its power levels because they're cut from the same cloth as Blood and Guts, Ninja Scrolls, or Legend of Wilburfine, or something like that. And not to mention just peak 90s cyberpunk aesthetic. So, you would think that I'd know how to end this video, but I don't. If we live in a just world, I hint at maybe talking about Pokemon Zen Show or something, but no, I can't. There's only one chapter scan, so maybe I'll take a swing at it by looking at the funny pictures. So next time you're going to see something, I guess. Have a good day. I don't know how to end videos. Hey folks, it's me, your old pal Sid. Sure was a fun video, wasn't it? Do you remember this manga? Did I just have a fever dream of this? Is it literally just horny people that are mad about censorship that remember it? Well, I don't know, maybe post in the comments, tell me more about your experience with it. That said, if you enjoyed that video, you know what to do next. And for the people that are already here and already liked the video and did all that good stuff, very good trainers. We're starting 2023 off the right way by actually putting out a video. Sorry this one isn't the yellow video. Shueisha knocking down my first draft of it really took the winds out of my sails, but hey, we're back on that grind and back to actually making things. So find me on social media. I stream very, very rarely. You can almost call it a shiny stream. And I'll catch you later, folks.